age of 94 and was buried by her husband's side. Okay, we're going to move to the next subtopic, which is President Johnson and Congress. And we're going to talk about some pieces of legislation that Johnson passed when he served out the remainder of Kennedy's term. And the first one was the very most important. And what Johnson did is 5 days after the assassination of President Kennedy, Johnson addressed Congress. And he asked Congress to complete all the programs that were initiated by President Kennedy. So Johnson made it his mission to make sure that the pieces of legislation that Kennedy started before his assassination were completed through Congress. So again, just 5 days after the assassination of President Kennedy, President Johnson addressed Congress, and he asked all members of Congress to complete the programs that were initiated by President Kennedy. Okay? Now I'd just be curious, when we think back, what was the big piece of legislation that Kennedy initiated that did not get finished? Civil Rights Act of 1964. Remember when I talked about that, and that was a piece of legislation that led to the March on Washington? And I said that this legislation would eventually be called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Well, Johnson's first step in the direction of passing Kennedy's legislation is he had Congress pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that was passed on July 2nd, 1964. So again, this was a piece of legislation that Kennedy initiated that led to the March on Washington, the support for the bill, and finally Johnson got it through on July 2nd, 1964. Then it became officially called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Do you remember what that did when Kennedy sent it to the Congress? You know, when they were sent it to Congress first time before it got passed? What was the purpose of it? What did it do? Anybody remember? That bad of a teacher. Civil Rights Act of 64. What did it desegregate? Desegregated the businesses that were segregating Negroes on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It changed to that. But when they first did it, it basically desegregated businesses that were discriminating against Negroes, including hotels and restaurants. Remember I told you the Vince Lombardi story where he had to try to find a hotel and a restaurant for his players to... The first part of that bill that Kennedy put out was to desegregate businesses and also desegregate companies that were being paid by who? Federal government. Okay? Well, Johnson added to that. He required the desegregation of businesses, and especially those that were getting government contracts, so to speak, but he basically, the Civil Rights Act stated that you could not discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Okay, so have you ever heard that before? You'll see disclaimers that people say, you know, we're going to hire, it won't be based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. You see that all the time now. Well, this is where this came from, is when Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in addition to desegregating businesses that were segregating Negroes, he also added that no one would be discriminated against on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So that's where that came from. So he piggybacked that on, and he got that done. Okay? Here are some other important laws that Johnson's passed during the remainder of the Kennedy term. The first one was known as VISTA. It's on your ID sheet, I believe, isn't it? VISTA? Yes. And that stood for Volunteers in Service to America. Okay, he passed a law called VISTA. And it stood for Volunteers in Service to America. Now what do you think that did? What did VISTA do? What did Volunteers in Service to America do? Anybody want to take a guess on that?
Community service.
What's that?
Community service.
Not so much. It's a good guess. It helped deal with poor people. Now what did we have that dealt with poor people that was foreign? What program did we have that was
Peace Corps.
the Peace Corps? Well, what VISTA was, basically, it was a domestic Peace Corps. It helped poor people in the United States. Okay? So it was a Peace Corps is helping people in foreign countries, right? The VISTA was Volunteers in Service to America, and it basically acted as a domestic Peace Corps in which gave people a chance to help poor people in the United States, okay? Another law that was passed by Johnson during the remainder of Kennedy's term was the Wilderness Act of 1964. The Wilderness Act of 1964. What do you think that did, you wilderness type people? What did the Wilderness Act of 1964 do? What's that?
Does it have to do with hunting?
Well, kind of. Has to do with four-wheeling, has to do with fishing, has to do with camping. It established 9 million acres of national forest and national park land as wilderness. Okay, couldn't be built upon, couldn't be changed, couldn't be, you know, it was wilderness. So I kind of screwed it up. Could you camp in wilderness country? But you couldn't drive your car in there and have your camper, but you could hike in and camp, right? So basically what the Wilderness Act of 64 did is it set aside 9 million acres of national forest land that we already had and said this is wilderness land, okay? This is not to be touched, not to be built upon, not to be disturbed. Could you walk in and camp? Sure. Could you pull your trailer in there and camp? No. Now, probably, and you benefited from this, the most important act, or at least one of them, that Johnson passed during the time he served out the Kennedy term was the National Defense Education Act. National Defense Education Act. And what simply the National Defense Education Act is, it gave for the first time federal dollars to schools, colleges, and universities. It gave federal dollars to schools, colleges, and universities. Now, underneath the National Defense Act were two kind of sub-acts, okay? One here and one here. And the first one was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Elementary and Secondary Education Act was part of this National Defense Act. Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Now, because you basketball players, or speech and debate people, or theater people, when you go to the state drama, do you have to pull money out of your pocket to pay for your meals? No. Do you have to pay for your registration? Do you have to pay to get on the bus and drive? No. That's because the Elementary and Secondary Education Act gave government money to elementary and secondary schools. So what is our money based on? Anybody know? We'll give you a little school lesson here. How do we know how much money we have in our budget at Washakie County School District number 1? What's that entirely based upon? How do we know how much government money we're going to get?
State standards.
No?
Like a school we have?
What?
Like a school we have?
Yeah.
You
right
get
there.
students and what
Student
they're
population.
enrolled in.
Wyoming is incredible. We get about $16,000 federal money per kid enrolled. So if you take the 1,500 kids that we have in this district and you times it by 16,000, that's a lot. That's where a majority of our budget comes. Montana's like, in Montana you get like 6,000 a kid. So I mean, Wyoming is
because we're so little.
mineral money, and you've chosen to do that with your money. That's why teachers get paid here. But anyway, that's how you decide. So when you look at federal money, how much we get from the government, it's based on student population. Right now, they're over there trying to figure out the budget for next year, if we're going to cut any teachers or cut anything based on how many students they think we're going to have this year compared to what we had last year. So if you have 1,500 kids in your district, and next year you're only going to have 1,400 because the ones that graduate, you know, just the population, then if you take 1,000 people and times it by 100 or 16,000, that's how much money we're going to be less next year. What's the biggest percentage of your overall budget used for? No?
Teacher.
Teacher and employer salary. Okay, about 80% of a school's budget is paying the teachers, the aides, the custodians, about 80% of a budget. So that leaves you about 20% to educate you and buy you books and send you on trips. The difference between Wyoming and Montana, I'm getting off the subject, but it all came because of this act, is that when I came here and heard that you didn't charge to get into games, I about fell over backwards. In Montana, you have to charge. You couldn't pay for your officials or anything if you didn't charge. It blows me away that you don't charge. And you know what else blows me away? It blows me away that you have to pay a participation fee to participate, and we don't charge to get in the games. But that's the different game Wyoming has because of what? Money. Okay? My wife got a $20,000 pay raise to come here to teach. $20,000. That's what a first-year teacher makes in a lot of schools in Montana. Wyoming pays well. Why? Because they get $16,000 a kid compared to Montana's 8. It's just nuts. Hey, anyway, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was part of the National Defense Act. What's the other part, do you think? Higher Education Act. And of course, that money went to where? Colleges and universities to provide aid. Where do you think this financial aid package you're getting to go to college comes from? A bunch of it. Except for poor Miss Lopez over there. She's going to go to that private Rocky Mountain College, Carroll College in Montana, private Catholic, private Methodist. Do they get government funding? No. So Kennedy's Catholic religion and the fact that he thought the Catholics would get everything if he was elected president, actually private schools don't get any federal funding. That's why Rocky's tuition is $30,000 a year, because they get no federal money. Okay, so the Higher Education Act gave money to help college-bound students, but just keep in mind, private schools do not get that kind of funding because it's tied in with the religion. So, does it seem like Johnson had much trouble getting these things passed? Why is that? Why did so many pieces of legislation during the time he served the rest of Kennedy's term get brought through Congress? Remember, you got a Republican and Democratic Congress. Okay, but why was it so? Who do you think controlled Congress at this point? Johnson's a Democrat. If he got everything passed through pretty easy, who controlled Congress? The Democratic Party. Now, why would they be so cooperative with Johnson?
Well, he was in Congress.
What?
He was the majority leader.
Well, kind of. Yeah, that's probably part of it. But what's coming up in '64? An election. A presidential election that they're pretty sure he's going to win. But what else comes in a presidential election? Congress, congressmen are elected, people in the House, people in the Senate, governors, a lot of that happens. So what if,
They
yeah.
wanted to keep their jobs and stuff.
Well, yeah, so whose support do these people that are running for re-election want? Whose support do they want? Presidents. And so it's I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back. I'll support your legislation, but when it's my turn to run for the Senate for re-election, I'm expecting you to put a good word in for me. That's what happened. So that's why Johnson had such an easy time getting legislation passed, because it was certain that Johnson was going to be the Democratic nominee for president. No question in '64, and many members of Congress that were Democrats wanted him to support them, which he did. It was the old Potomac two-step, we call it. Okay? All right, let's move on to the election of 1964. Okay? Johnson served out the remainder of Kennedy's term. He's all prepped, and he's going to run for his own election in 1964. Okay? So, the mystery's kind of out on who the Democratic nominee for president's going to be. It's going to be Lyndon B. Johnson. The only drama at the Democratic National Convention was who he was going to choose as what? His vice presidential running mate. Now, of all the people we've talked about, as far as if you go back to the election of 1960 and the guys that were thinking about running for nomination and blah, 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 who do you think he chose? Who was a key player in 1960 that lost the nomination to Kennedy, other than Johnson himself? How about this guy right here? Hubert Humphrey. Okay? So Johnson tabbed Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota, senator, to be his running mate in 1964. So the Democrats pretty cinched up early. Johnson for president, Humphrey for vice president. The big question is, who are the Republicans going to nominate? Okay? Now, the Republican Party was kind of split at this time. You had conservative Republicans and liberal Republicans. And the conservative part of the Republican Party wanted Senator Barry Goldwater, right here, the guy in the glasses. That's who they were supporting for the presidential nomination in '64. The conservative Republicans were supporting Barry Goldwater. and he was a senator from Arizona. But the Liberals weren't sure. But as I've told you before, in a presidential election, can you have a split in philosophy and win? Now, the Democratic Party always hoped for that because, like I said before, probably it's changes, but at least 70% of Americans, if you polled them, said they would be Republican, and 30 would say they're Democrat. So the Democrats have to get their votes and some of the Republican votes to win an election. Okay? So you can't have a split in the Republican Party. So the conservatives really need the support of the Liberals here, and the conservatives want Goldwater. So how are they going to work this out so that Goldwater gets the nomination? What's Goldwater going to promise the Liberals?
Liberal vice president.
Very good, he will nominate a Liberal vice presidential candidate. So the word gets out through the conservative Republicans that if you nominate Barry Goldwater of Arizona as a Republican candidate, then Goldwater's camp gave him the idea that they would in turn make a Liberal vice presidential running mate. So, as a result, Goldwater was nominated easily on the first ballot for the presidency, and then the mystery became which Liberal would Goldwater appoint as vice president. Well, he picked a congressman by the name of William Miller. He picked a congressman by the name of William Miller. Shelby Hodges, what was the problem with that? What was the problem with that choice? Anybody want to guess? What? He wasn't liberal. Goldwater went with a conservative William Miller after kind of giving the idea out to the liberal wing that he was going to pick a liberal. Well, what do you think the liberal wing thought of that? And what did they do? What did they do in protest? They voted Democrat. And I'll tell you, Goldwater only received 52 electoral votes to Johnson's 486. So this was a butt kicking of the century. If you get 55% of the popular vote, that's a pretty good margin in a presidential election. Johnson got 61% of the popular vote and scored 486 electoral votes to Goldwater's 52. What a colossal, 486 to 52, what a colossal screw up on Goldwater's part. I don't even know, politicians, historians still don't know quite what he was thinking about there. You know what I mean? Maybe he thought he could slip one by him that they'd support the party anyway. When you have 486 electoral votes in an election, you have gotten many votes from the opposing party. Many. And that's what happened. So with that, Johnson is elected President of the United States. Okay, he's still the 36th president because he assumed Kennedy's term, and now he will be on to his own agenda. Okay? But keep in mind, despite what you might hear about Lyndon Johnson, that he was not a big fan of the Kennedys. We've talked about that, but he did what was honorable, and he tried to finish President Kennedy's term as the way Kennedy would like to finish. You think Kennedy would have liked to have a VISTA, a volunteer program in the United States? Sure he would have. Think he would have liked the Wilderness Act? Sure he would have. Would he have liked education, getting some money? That was one of his biggest concerns because he was Catholic? Sure. So Johnson did a nice job. And the Civil Rights Act of '64 topped the whole thing. Okay, so he did a really nice job. But now he's on to his own agenda, which takes us to the next subtopic, which is President Johnson's Great Society. What do you think that is? Is that the name of his administration, possibly? What was Kennedy's? Do you remember? The New Frontier. Well, Johnson's administration is going to be known as the Great Society. And it consisted of 3 political philosophies. So President Johnson's Great Society, that would be the name of his administration, and it would consist of 3 political philosophies. What do you think Great Society? If I said Great Society, what do you think he's thinking about? If he wants a great society. What is a great society?
No poverty.
Hold that thought. Number 1, the number 1 philosophy was to keep the nation's economy growing strong. That was the number 1 philosophy of the Great Society. Not number 1, it was 1 of 3. To keep the nation's economy growing strong. to keep the nation's economy growing strong. Emily, what did you say you thought the Great Society might amount to?
No poverty.
No poverty. Well, see how this comes for number 2 and number 3. Number 2, to open opportunities tomorrow for all Americans that only a few enjoy today. To open opportunities tomorrow for all Americans that only a few enjoyed today. Again, the Great Society number 2, to open opportunities tomorrow for all Americans that only a few enjoyed today. And then number 3 goes along with what Emily said too. Number 3, to improve the quality of life for all, not just a chosen few. To improve the quality of life for all, not just a chosen few. So again, here are the 3 political philosophies under the Great Society. Number 1, to keep the nation's economy growing strong. Number 2, to open opportunities tomorrow for all Americans that only a few enjoy today. And number 3, to improve the quality of life for all, not just a chosen few. So where is he going to concentrate his administration? On helping people that are less advantaged, thus creating what he thought would be a great society in which everyone had the same opportunities despite maybe their race, religion, or even financial means. Okay? Now, we told you about legislation that was passed during the remainder of Kennedy's term. I'm going to tell you about some important legislation that was passed during the Great Society. And I'm going to get a little off color here. And so hopefully you can handle it and you don't go and tell your parents that I'm a bad man. Because I'm going to tell you the Grandma Dürr story by the time this thing gets done, okay? And you got to be mature to be able to listen to it. You can't go and tell your parents that I told you this story. Yeah, we're on our next subtopic. Legislation passed during the Great Society, including one that my mother cherished. And I'll just give you an example of how much she cherished it when we get done. But it is a little off color. If anybody here can't handle it, because you can leave if you don't want it. You go back to Finland and tell this story. Okay, during his own term, Johnson's number 1 priority was medical care for the elderly. Number 1 priority was medical care for the elderly. That was very important to him, that he could provide medical care for the elderly, because prior to his administration, there really wasn't any. So, President Johnson's top priority, you guys are fairly chatty today, aren't you, over there? President Johnson's top priority during his own term was the issue of medical care for the elderly. So in July of 1965, he signed a new bill into law called the Medicare Bill of 1965. You've all heard of Medicare, have you not?
Yeah.
It's a big deal in today's society. We'll explain the whole thing. So in July of 1965, President Johnson signed into law a new bill called the Medicare Bill of 1965. And this new bill, when it was first put out, provided these 3 things to people in America. Okay, now make sure you get the ages here so you understand. Okay, so this new bill, the Medicare Bill of 1965, provided these following 3 things to people in America. Number 1, it gave all citizens age 65 and over low-cost hospital insurance. Okay, the Medicare Bill of 1965 gave all citizens age 65 and over low-cost hospital insurance. All citizens age 65 and over receive low-cost hospital insurance. Okay, number 2, it gave all citizens age 65 and over low-cost medical insurance. It gave all citizens age 65 and over low-cost medical insurance. Okay, now Daylin, just think about that a minute. What is the difference between hospital insurance and medical insurance? You got to be thinking that, because I said you're going to see what's the difference, right? What's the difference? Hospital insurance is what they charge you to stay in the hospital. Okay, what is medical insurance, Saskia?
It's for all the medication.
Doctor, when you go to the hospital, okay, my father-in-law had, I want to report, successful heart surgery yesterday, God bless him, 88 years old. But Medicare is going to help him a ton, because he's got this insurance. The hospital is going to bill him for the hospital stay, okay? And the meals and that type of thing they bring him. Then the doctor, the anesthesiologist is going to send him a bill. And then the doctor that provided the surgery is going to send him a bill, right? And then they're going to give him a bunch of prescription pills to take, which are going to be out of hospital expenses. So the hospital insurance pays for his stay in the hospital. The medical expenses are the doctor bill, the anesthesiologist bill, the medication they gave him, those types of things that he may need once he leaves the hospital, okay? Well, the Medicare bill of 65 provided low-cost insurance. It's paying for insurance so that every person 65 or older can have hospital insurance, can have medical insurance at a premium they can afford, okay? The third thing it did is the Medicare bill of 1965 gave federal grants to individual states. It gave federal grants. What's a federal grant? Federal money, okay? But if they give you a grant, they're going to want you to use it for a specific thing, right? Okay? So these federal grants that were given to states under number 3 were given to each state to help people with hospital insurance and medical insurance who were under the age of 65. Okay? So the third part of the Medicare bill of 1965 were federal grants or federal monies to individual states, and then whose decision was it to figure out how they were going to use that? Each state. But the criteria was, find a way to help your people in your state that are under the age of 65 to get low-cost hospital and medical insurance. But they left that up to each state so they could differ, okay? Now, that was really important. Now, do you want to hear the Grandma Dure story, and can you handle it?
Sure. We didn't write it down.
I would not. In fact, I'm thinking about turning off the recorder, which I'm going to. God bless you, Mom.